What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so now that we're getting back into the swing of things of our regularly scheduled programming, in this one, we continue our discussion on the return of Bruce Wayne. Now remember, the whole premise of Dark Knight's Metal is that it's really rooted in Final Crisis, right? Like we talked about that with regards to the main Final Crisis event and to the first video that we did on the return of Bruce Wayne, in the sense that in Final Crisis, Bruce Wayne was basically time displaced. He was thrown all the way back to the very early days of man. But what he began doing was basically scribbling all these different drawings, these symbols of the Justice League, of Superman, Wonder Woman, Cyborg, and Batman himself. The result is that he basically inspired the creation of a new tribe known as the Bat Tribe. Now again, that matters because if you've been reading Dark Knight's Metal, what we know is that somewhere along the line in humanity's history, there arose the Bat Tribe. This basically says it's all because of Bruce Wayne. At the same time, Bruce being time displaced, being thrown all the way back to the early days of humanity, got the attention of Barbados in the Dark Multiverse. And that's what inspired Barbados to basically realize the positive multiverse was there and attempt to find a way to invade it. So what this does is just continue this story of the return of Bruce Wayne. And as we go through this, you'll see little moments here and there where we'll basically kind of hint back to the events of Dark Knight's Metal, hint back to the idea of Barbados. We basically had Batman fighting against this giant tentacle monster and trying to defeat it as best he could. Now, this monster is actually a concept. It actually has a name. In order to avoid spoilers, we'll talk about what that purpose is later, but for right now, it is a pretty cool concept. But one of the things that you notice is that it's basically chasing Bruce Wayne throughout the time stream, because where the first video had him in the early days of humanity, this video right now has him in the old colonial days, specifically in the early days of Gotham City. And it's pretty cool because what we end up doing here is having him basically just picked up by some woman who's just kind of out there in the woods somewhere. She nurses him back to health and that kind of thing. But remember, when it comes to Bruce Wayne, when he was time displaced, for the most part, his memories are gone. He doesn't really remember anything about who he was. He basically was sent back to the early days of man as a fresh slate with these little bits of memories here and there, little indications like Justice League, different things like that. And so he was able to maintain some measure of his identity. But from here, what we actually do is jump to a place called the Vanishing Point. Now, the Vanishing Point's an actually, a really interesting concept, because to the best of my understanding, the Vanishing Point more or less kind of exists like this idea that every universe has its own vanishing point. I'm not 100% sure about that. So if you're somebody who's very familiar with it, feel free to chime down in the comments section so I can add that little tidbit of knowledge to my mental database of DC Comics. With Bruce Wayne being thrown back into the past, this effectively initiated a sort of hunt of sorts with like Superman and the Green Lantern and Rip Hunter, a well-known time traveler in DC Comics, as well as Booster Gold, to basically find Bruce Wayne and to bring him back. Now, one of the things that I hope you guys also notice here is that Superman and Green Lantern are really kind of the heavy hitters in this particular bit of a story. But with Booster Gold and with Rip Hunter, they're very familiar with the time stream. And so they've basically grabbed time travelers to go with them and help them navigate the waters. Them arriving at the Vanishing Point, the long and short is that this is basically where all things coalesce. The indication is that you have the very beginnings of the universe, or even the multiverse, if you want to go that far back. But no matter what happens, all these different universes that spawn, that just kind of come into existence by any manner of any particular situation, they all basically coalesce down into a singular point. And that singular point is the end of all things, the collapse of the multiverse, so to speak. The Vanishing Point basically exists in the moments before the multiverse collapses. And the whole idea is that the Vanishing Point basically allows these sort of timekeepers to essentially stand at the end of all things and to basically just categorize and quantify and essentially make a giant time capsule, in the sense that they basically document and they record everything that's ever happened throughout the time stream, so that when everything comes to an end and it's reborn, memories of the previous universe will be kept on. It'll be, given to the next generation or something along those lines. And so what we end up having is this sort of biological slash, technological device, basically this being that kind of exists at the end of this time stream, who's essentially telling, these guys who are here, the person you're looking for, Bruce Wayne, is time displaced. He's out here in this exact location. But it's kind of cool because it's basically sort of Grant Morrison giving us this perception of all these different things that exist out there, basically every single moment in time. And it's all really interesting because Superman points out that finding Batman is going to be a lot harder than they thought it would be, because if each one of these, spheres basically represents a singular moment, then what they have to do is just literally go through every single one of these moments and try to find Batman. The problem is that it's not that simple, because basically the entire collapse of the multiverse is happening in like 9.5 minutes. So basically they don't have enough time to try to find Bruce. Now the cool thing about this is, jumping back to the modern day, what we end up having is Bruce Wayne basically adopting the moniker of Mordecai. When it comes to Bruce, his instincts as a detective are really kind of embedded into who he is. And that's one of the things that Morrison hints on here. It's been such an ingrained part of his life. It's who he is. Being a detective is like eating or sleeping or drinking. It's just a fundamental nature of what makes him who he is. And so the cool thing is that what he ends up doing is investigating this bat that's basically been pinned to a door. And again, that's the nature of this. Because of the fact that the Bat Tribe had risen to prominence, because the Bat Tribe kind of signified the devil based on different religious groups, that's how things are viewed here. And Colony Hill, it's basically this idea that bats kind of signify the devil, that bats signify evil, different things along those lines. And there's a long history of that, even here in the real world, the history of bats in terms of how people view them, the bad omens they represent, different things along those lines. So again, there's a lot of Grant Morrison grabbing some real world concepts and throwing them in. But basically, Bruce Wayne goes through, under the name of Mordecai, he goes through and basically does this huge investigation about a missing man by the name of Matthew, I think it is. And the whole idea is that he basically starts looking at all these different clues, coming to the realization that a knitting needle was used to basically, stab Matthew, or at least, it has blood on it, that the clothes of Matthew were basically sewn up and they were kept, in pretty decent condition. And what he basically draws the conclusion of is that Matthew's wife killed him. That was basically what happened. Now, in response to this, the local community begins to freak out, and all of it's done under a guy named Brother Malleus. Brother Malleus is sort of an indication, or at least the closest thing we get to a villain in this story. But remember, Grant Morrison's grabbing a lot of real world themes. Back during the days of the Salem witch trial, it was basically this idea that if people didn't understand what was going on with regards to how the world worked and people in it, they would just chart it up to witchcraft. This person does a thing I don't really understand. They look different, or they talk different, or whatever the case may be. They're not like the rest of us. They're not like us Christians, therefore they're witches. And so that was a huge thing, all over the place. The idea of Malleus, he essentially goes through and finds people who are witches. Now again, this is all really kind of nonsense. The fact that this woman would grab a bat, she would pin it to a church door. The argument is that she's a witch. Now we're not explicitly told why. She's just being charged with witchcraft. And so the result is that Bruce basically sort of leaves. And what he ends up doing is picking back up with this girl named Annie. It gives us a little bit of information about what's going on here. The fact that Brother Malleus is basically just a witch finder, but there's still a lot of information about what's going on. With the character of Annie, it really kind of fleshes her out in the sense that she seems to be a legitimate witch who really ascribes to like nature, different things like that. Says, I don't really believe in the Judeo-Christian God. For me, it's the gods of nature, different things along those lines. But the indication here, regardless of the circumstances, is that in his mind, she's more of an outlier. She's more of an outcast. And that creates kind of a bond between the two of them, because while he's operating under the name Mordecai, he still doesn't really remember anything about himself. And so in a lot of ways, he views himself as an outcast. So it creates a bit of a bond between these two people. Now from here, we basically pick up with the body of Matthew, which is essentially torn apart more or less, or at least at the very least been burned. But it's this idea that Bruce Wayne is using his detective skills instinctively to look at this entire situation and to realize there's basically something going on here. There's a bigger picture taking place here than what these guys believe. With the character of Malleus, he basically starts making all these different claims and talking about things like an eclipse and so on and so forth, and it starts to sort of ring some bells in the mind of Bruce Wayne. He gets these little glimpses from the first book that we talked about, this big eclipse, different things like that, just small little moments here and there, not enough to put the pieces together, but enough to create some measure of understanding about what's going on. So what he ends up doing is immediately traveling back to Annie and demanding to know what his story is. And what Annie basically says is that as far as she knows, he just rose out of the water one day. She doesn't know where he came from. She has no idea who he is or what he's about. But in her mind, because of the fact that the town is filled with people who are so hubris, who are so arrogant, who are so full of the idea that they are Christian and right because God told them so, is basically this notion that she considers them to be the downtrodden failure in society. In her mind, their desire to pull out witches here and there is basically going on a crusade to destroy things they don't understand. But in her mind, she's basically making this case that a time will come when they will most likely destroy themselves, whatever the case may be, and she's just sort of waiting until it happens. But what she also says is she had basically prayed to her own gods, and she had summoned a beast that she thought would be capable of taking out all these arrogant people. And so what we end up finding out is that this monster that essentially shows up on the scene is the same one that's been tracking Bruce Wayne. So it's interesting because with Annie traveling back to her home, she ends up finding it raided by Brother Malleus and all his various forces, and it's essentially this idea that she's just guilty of witchcraft. They throw her on trial, they immediately find her guilty, and they basically throw her into the fire pit, and that's about it. And so while Bruce Wayne tries to take out, these tentacles and tries to destroy this monster, at the same time, it's also a bit of recognition. Looking around this cave, he begins to realize this cave is familiar. The indication is that this is the Batcave. This is Gotham City before it becomes Gotham City. And it's interesting because in this moment, what we do is we jump back to the vanishing point, and we pick up with, Superman and Green Lantern and Rip Hunter and, Booster Gold. And we end up finding out that this construct they've been talking to is actually Bruce Wayne at the end of time. And what he says is that he's on a mission to essentially, quote unquote, fix things. Very cloak and dagger. We're not given a lot of information here. But what Superman says is that Batman's basically been turned into a booby trap when Darkseid hit him with the Omega Sanction and sent him back to the beginning of time where he was supposed to have died. Instead, what's happening here is that Darkseid sent something else after Bruce Wayne and relied on his detective instincts. And so what this means is that Darkseid not only time displaced Bruce Wayne, he sent whatever this monster is after Bruce, hoping that Bruce's detective skills would kick in and he would just start time hopping. The result is that he would end up in the modern day and effectively activate whatever trap it was that Darkseid had set up. And so again, it's interesting because a lot of this stuff is very ambiguous. There's a lot of clues here, but we're not really given any definitive answers to things. Not only that, what we also end up finding out is that this man, Brother Malleus, is actually a guy named Nathaniel Wayne, the first member of the Wayne family to take up residence in Gotham City. And that's what's so crazy about this, because what Grant Morrison says is that where previously we just kind of left to our own devices and left to believe that the Wayne family was honorable and they did great things. In truth, they're rooted in ignorance. They're rooted in bias, cruelty. And that's what's so crazy about this, is because it basically says that's the nature of the Waynes. The Waynes are people who just do terrible things over the course of their existence, and it wasn't until society got a little bit smarter and got a little bit wiser that they did the same thing. And so what we end up doing here is finding out that with Annie more or less being eliminated due to the claims of witchcraft, where Bruce is essentially time displaced yet again, Gotham City began to grow. Gotham City began to expand, and it turned into the town that we've become most familiar with leading up to the modern day. And so the way the story ends is with Bruce basically rising out of the ocean, just like he did, when he first met Annie, rising out of a lake, only for him to have a boot pushed to his head, and then for us to find out he's in the era of the pirates. Not only that, he's basically being gang pressed onto the crew of Blackbeard. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.